There's a silent, almost invisible line that runs through every town, every city, every neighborhood where honest men punch a clock and bust their backs. It ain't drawn on any map, but you feel it in the pit of your stomach when the bills come due, or in the tightness in your chest when you look at your kids and wonder if their path will be any different than yours. It's the line between getting by and getting ahead, between what you've always had and what you secretly hope for. Most men, good men, decent men, live their whole lives straddling that line, maybe leaning a little one way or the other, always believing it's fixed, unmovable, a part of the landscape. They work hard, sure. They show up, they do their job, they put in the hours. But often beneath the sweat and the strain, there's a quiet whisper, a resignation that says, "This is my lot. This is what I'm due." They see the world as a game with rules already set and their place in it, a chair already taken. And so they work enough to keep the lights on, enough to put food on the table, enough to avoid trouble. They give what's expected, no more, no less, convinced that true success, that real freedom, belongs to someone else, to the lucky ones, to the ones born on the other side of that invisible line. They fear wasting energy, pouring their very being into something that will never truly change their station, like trying to empty the ocean with a teacup. They believe the system is rigged, not maliciously, but just rigged. And that belief, silent and insidious, is often the heaviest chain of all. But then every now and again you meet a man who saw that line not as a barrier, but as a challenge. A man who, through sheer grit and a sudden, sharp clarity, decided to redraw the damn thing himself. Lester was one of those men who lived firmly, stubbornly, on the just-get-by side of that line for most of his life. 48 years old, his shoulders had already begun to slope forward from years spent on the assembly line at the Allied manufacturing plant, shaping steel into components for heavy machinery. His uniform, a faded blue work shirt and grease-stained jeans, seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin, molded to his frame. He wasn't a big man, not in the imposing sense, but there was a density to him, a quiet strength built from repetitive, unglamorous labor. You could see it in his hands, calloused and thick, the knuckles permanently swollen, each scar a silent testament to a close call with a grinder or a dropped wrench. His fingers, despite their roughness, still held a surprising dexterity, able to thread a bolt or reassemble a carburetor with an economy of motion that only comes from decades of practice. His face was a roadmap of responsibility. Fine lines fanned out from the corners of his eyes, etched deeper by the flicker of fluorescent lights in the factory and the constant, unspoken worries of a family man. His hair, once a sandy brown, was now mostly gray, clipped short and practical. He rarely smiled broadly, not because he was unhappy, but because a deep, reflective quietness was simply his nature. His default expression was one of mild contemplation, a steady gaze that observed more than it revealed. He carried himself with a quiet weight, not of burden, but of constancy, like a sturdy oak in a field, unmoving, reliable. People at the plant knew Lester as the guy who showed up on time, never called in sick unless he was on death's door, and kept his head down. He wasn't one for locker room jokes or long coffee break chats. He'd nod, maybe offer a low grunt of acknowledgement, and then return to his post, a silent sentinel in the symphony of grinding metal and whirring machinery. His weariness wasn't an outward display, no slumping shoulders or sighs, but rather a deep-seated hum beneath the surface, a quiet acknowledgement of the endless push and pull of life and his place within it. He was a man who didn't complain, not out loud anyway, but his eyes, often tired, held that underlying, stubborn resilience, the kind that knew how to absorb a hit and keep standing, even if it meant just barely. He was reliable to a fault, a constant in a world that often felt chaotic, and in his own unassuming way, he was proud of that. Yet, beneath the dependable exterior, there lurked a quiet cynicism, a belief born of experience that the scales were always tipped, and no amount of extra effort would truly move them in his favor. He saw his work, his time, his sweat as a commodity exchanged for a finite sum, and the idea of investing more than the agreed-upon amount felt to him like a fool's errand. It was simply how things were. His world began before the sun thought about it, a faint, rhythmic vibration from the cheap alarm clock on his nightstand cutting through the pre-dawn quiet. 5 a.m. It wasn't a choice. It was simply the start of the current chapter. He'd swing his legs over the side of the bed, the familiar creak of the old springs a muted complaint in the still house. Sarah, his wife, would stir faintly beside him, a soft sigh but rarely fully wake. She knew his rhythm just as he knew hers. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled faintly of stale coffee and the promise of toast from yesterday. Lester would make his coffee, black and strong, the old percolator gurgling its morning song, a counterpoint to the quiet hum of the refrigerator that needed its coils cleaned again. He'd eat a piece of toast, maybe some oatmeal, staring out the window at the gray light just beginning to fracture the darkness. He rarely thought much during these moments, just existed, preparing his body for the day's labor. Then came the short drive to the factory, the same route he'd driven for 23 years. The industrial park, a monument to practical, unromantic work. Inside, it was a cavern of steel and noise, the air thick with the smell of oil and metal. His station, a hydraulic press stamping out brackets for heavy machinery. All day, the same motion. Load the raw steel, engage the press, unload the finished piece, repeat. Thud hiss clank, 1,000 times a day. Each piece indistinguishable from the last, each movement a practiced dance that required focus but no real thought. His hands, calloused and thick-fingered, knew the rhythm intrinsically. His mind, however, often drifted. It drifted to the house, the small, older two-bedroom place they called home in the working-class neighborhood. It was a good house, solid bones, but time had started taking its toll. The roof needed doing, gutters were sagging, and he knew a draft snaked its way through the living room window every winter. Repairs he couldn't quite afford, or more accurately, couldn't quite find the extra time or money for, when just keeping the lights on and food on the table felt like its own full-time job. Every 2 weeks, the pay stub arrived, and every 2 weeks, the mental arithmetic began. Mortgage, utilities, car payment, for the aging sedan that was starting to rust at the wheel wells. Groceries, school supplies for Emily and Mark, a new pair of shoes for Mark, whose feet seemed to grow overnight, a textbook for Emily's advanced placement class. There was always enough, just barely, never a surplus, never a cushion. It was a tightrope walk, month after month, year after year. He'd pay the bills, line them up neatly on the kitchen counter, and watch the numbers shrink, leaving just enough to scrape by until the next check. Beneath that surface of quiet reliability, a different kind of calculation played out in Lester's mind. It wasn't just about the bills, it was about the why. He started at the factory with a young man's ambition, a flicker of wanting to climb, to do more than just stamp metal. He'd seen older men, bent by years of the same work, and told himself he wouldn't be them. He dreamed of something different, a small business perhaps, a way to build something with his hands that wasn't just another part for another machine. Those dreams had slowly, almost imperceptibly, receded, like a tide pulling back from the shore, leaving behind only the wet, hard-packed sand of reality. What haunted Lester wasn't failure in the dramatic sense. It was the quiet, insidious fear of stasis, of being stuck. He saw himself in a loop, a dependable cog in a vast machine, doing his part, doing it well, but never truly moving forward. He'd watched others get promotions, move into management, but he'd always told himself that wasn't his path, that he wasn't political enough, or perhaps not smart enough in the right way. That cynicism, the one about the system being rigged, had become a comfortable if disheartening blanket. It protected him from the pain of trying and failing, but it also suffocated the hope of trying and succeeding. The gap between who he was, the reliable, quiet factory man, and who he'd once yearned to be, the man who built, who created, who provided more than just enough, had grown into a chasm. He didn't talk about it. He didn't complain. He just carried that quiet weight, an internal ledger of what might have been, balanced against the stark figures of what actually was. He pushed it down deep, telling himself it was foolish to yearn for things beyond his reach. The idea of extra effort felt like throwing good money after bad, like pouring water into a leaky bucket. He was good at his job, knew the routines, could do it with his eyes closed, and that he thought was the sum of his potential. Just enough to get by. And the quiet dread was that just enough might not always be enough, but he didn't know how to change the equation. The quiet dread was that just enough might not always be enough, but he didn't know how to change the equation. Every workday started with the guttural groan of the alarm clock at 5 a.m. It wasn't a gentle chime or a soothing melody. It was a blaring, mechanical shriek that ripped through the pre-dawn silence like a banshee. Lester would usually flinch, his shoulders tensing, before reaching out a calloused hand to slap it into submission. The air in the small bedroom was always cool, a damp chill that seemed to cling to the walls of their older house. He'd swing his legs over the side of the bed, the familiar creak of the floorboards a soundtrack to his waking, and sit for a moment, head in hands, listening to the soft, even breathing of Sarah beside him. Downstairs, the kitchen was his sanctuary of solitude. He'd put the kettle on, the hiss and gurgle of heating water the only conversation he allowed himself before the day truly began. A cup of instant coffee, black and bitter, was his communion. He'd stand by the window, watching the streetlights cut through the lingering dark, the bare branches of the oak tree in their front yard silhouetted against a sky that was still more purple than blue. Emily and Mark would still be deep in sleep, their teenage dreams undisturbed by the harsh realities of the coming. He'd always leave a mental note to fix that rattling pane of glass in the kitchen window or the draft under the back door, but the repairs always slid to the bottom of a list too long and too expensive to tackle. The roof was the big one, a silent, growing worry that he tried to push to the farthest corners of his mind. By 6, he was in his beat-up pickup truck, the engine sputtering to life with a familiar cough. The drive to the factory was a blur of sleepy side streets and then the main drag, where the first signs of industry started to appear. The towering smokestacks, the chain-link fences, the dull roar that began to build even before you saw the buildings. Lester was a welder, had been for 25 years. He was good at it, precise, efficient. His hands, thick and strong, moved with unpracticed grace, shaping metal under the blinding flash of his torch. The smell of ozone and burnt steel was as familiar as the smell of his own home. The rhythmic clang of machinery, the shouts of foremen, the constant whir of conveyor belts. It was all a symphony of monotony. Each piece he welded was identical to the last, and the next, and the one after that. Time blurred in the fluorescent glare, broken only by the short lunch break in the noisy cafeteria, where conversations were mostly about sports, cars, or how much overtime was being offered. Lester usually ate his sandwich in silence, observing, absorbing, but rarely contributing. The money, of course, was always the elephant in the room, or rather, the phantom that haunted every corner of their small house. There was enough for groceries, mostly. Enough for the power bill if he was careful. Enough for Mark's occasional new pair of sneakers if they bought them on sale. But enough never seemed to stretch to a new roof, or to the mounting repair bills on the old house, or to the future that was slowly but surely bearing down on them like an oncoming train. Every month was a delicate balancing act, a high-wire walk over a pit of debt. He saw the numbers on the statements, the ever-so-slight increases in utility costs, the rising price of everything, and he felt the vice tighten. This wasn't the life he'd imagined, not when he was a young man with fire in his belly and calluses not yet formed on his dreams. The factory wasn't supposed to be his destination, just a stop along the way. But the years had a way of grinding down ambition, hadn't they? He'd bought into the idea that putting in extra was pointless. Why burn himself out for a system that wouldn't acknowledge it beyond a pat on the back? The fear wasn't just about failing. It was about trying with every fiber of his being, emptying the tank, and still seeing his family staring at the same cracked ceiling, the same worn-out furniture, the same looming worries. He internalized it, that fear, letting it fester into a quiet, simmering resentment against a world he felt was stacked against him. He saw others climb, others get ahead, but his own cynicism whispered that their success was a matter of luck or connections or a willingness to play games he wouldn't. His effort, he believed, was capped by his pay grade. There was no breaking out, not for a man like him, not without risking the meager security they already had. So he got by, just enough. And every quiet moment, every sleepless hour was permeated by the low thrum of that question. What if just enough wasn't enough for long? What if he really was stuck forever? The air in the house grew thick with anticipation that spring, smelling faintly of old wood and the nervous energy of a teenager. Emily, his daughter, had pored over college brochures for months, her face alight with a future Lester had quietly, almost reluctantly, dreamed for her. She wasn't meant for the factory floor, he'd always thought. She had a mind that whirred like a finely tuned engine, a spirit that craved more than just getting by. Then came the envelope, thick, official, bearing the logo of the state university she'd set her heart on. The moment she tore it open, a gasp escaped her lips, quickly followed by a joyous shriek that echoed through their small living room. She'd done it. Accepted. Lester felt a warmth spread through his chest, a rare thaw in the permafrost of his anxieties. Sarah pulled Emily into a tight hug, tears in her eyes, while Mark, ever the pragmatist, immediately started calculating tuition costs. That night they celebrated with store-bought cake and plastic party hats. For a few precious hours, the weight lifted. It felt like they had defied gravity, if only for a moment. But the next few weeks brought them crashing back to Earth. The scholarship, generous as it was, wasn't a full ride, not even close. It was a good start, a solid hand-up, but the remaining balance was still a mountain range. Lester and Sarah spent evenings hunched over the kitchen table, the glow of a single lamp illuminating bank statements and loan applications. They called numbers, filled out forms, ran their fingers down columns of figures that seemed to mock their hard work with their sheer size. Lester felt that familiar vice tighten again, but this time it squeezed harder. It wasn't just his own dreams he was burying, it was Emily's. Then came the final, brutal blow, a short, impersonal letter from the financial aid office. Denied, not enough income, they said, too much debt. The words blurred on the page, but the meaning was crystal clear. Emily's dream, their family's one shot at something truly different, was out of reach. Lester found Emily in her room later that evening. She was sitting on her bed, a history textbook open on her lap, though her eyes weren't focused on the words. Her shoulders were slumped, her hair falling over her face. He sat beside her, the mattress groaning under his weight. She didn't look up at first. He could feel the tremor in her body, the way her breath hitched. They said no, Dad, she whispered, her voice barely audible like a dying ember. They said we don't make enough. And then she lifted her head, and in her eyes he saw it. Not just sadness, but a raw, gut-wrenching despair that mirrored every fear he'd ever had about being trapped. It was the same look he'd caught in his own reflection on too many mornings. The weariness, the resignation, the silent understanding that some things just weren't meant for people like them. Her dream, bright and hopeful just weeks ago, was curdling into the same sour acceptance he'd lived with for decades. He saw his own life, his own quiet surrender playing out in her young face, and it hit him harder than any punch he'd ever taken in the factory. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about her. His cynicism, his belief that the system was rigged, that effort was capped, that just enough was all there was, it all shattered into a million sharp, piercing pieces. He had to break the cycle. He had to create the difference. Not hope for it, not pray for it, but forge it with his own damn hands. That night, Lester didn't go to bed. He went to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and sat at the chipped formica table, the same table where he and Sarah had wrestled with bills, where Emily had done her homework, where Mark had spilled his cereal countless times. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the old refrigerator and the rhythmic drip of a leaky faucet, a repair he'd been meaning to get to for months. The hands on the clock crept past midnight, then 1, then 2, then 3. The darkness outside the window was absolute, reflecting nothing but the faint glow of the street lamp down the block. He was alone with his thoughts, and they were brutal, unforgiving. What had he been doing all these years? Just getting by, he'd told himself. Playing it safe, not pushing too hard, not risking what little they had. He accepted the narrative that a man in his position had a ceiling, a fixed limit to his potential. He'd convinced himself that working harder than the next guy was for suckers, for the naive dreamers who hadn't yet learned that the world didn't reward effort, it rewarded luck or connections. He saw the truth now, stark and ugly. He hadn't just been playing it safe, he'd been playing it small. He hadn't just been accepting his lot, he'd been choosing it day after quiet day, shift after monotonous shift. He thought of Emily's face etched with that silent, crushing despair. That was his doing. His fear of failure, his comfortable cynicism, his resignation had become a brick wall in her path. He had taught her not through words, but through his very existence, that just enough was the limit. And now, just enough wasn't enough to get his daughter into college. It wasn't enough to fix the roof, or replace Sarah's rattling old car, or even give them a cushion against the next inevitable setback. A bitter laugh escaped him, dry and hollow in the silence. All that talk about the system being rigged. Maybe it was a little. But he had rigged his own life, too. He had given up on the fight before he'd even truly started throwing punches. He'd been so afraid of wasting effort, of trying and still failing, that he hadn't truly tried at all beyond the bare minimum. He had told himself he was smart, that he understood the game. But what kind of smart man stood by and watched his daughter's dream die because he was too comfortable in his own quiet despair? The weight of it all pressed down on him, a physical ache in his chest. His failure wasn't just about money, it was about spirit. He had let his fire dwindle to embers, had let the calluses on his dreams harden into a crust of resignation. He looked at his hands, rough and scarred from years of factory work, hands that had built things, fixed things, provided. But had they built enough? Had they fixed enough? Had they provided enough opportunity, enough hope, enough belief for his family? The answer, screamed by the silent, judging hour of 3 a.m., was a resounding, sickening no. Felt like a fraud, a man who had settled for mediocrity and then blamed the world for it. The shame was a visceral thing, a hot, creeping sensation that coiled in his gut. He had to change, not just for Emily, but for himself, For the man he used to be, the man who still, somewhere deep down, remembered what it felt like to burn. He didn't make any grand declarations. The kind you hear in movies, all dramatic music and swelling resolve. Lester wasn't that kind of man. He was the kind who fixed a leaky faucet without a word, just the clink of wrenches and the eventual silence of dripping water. This was an internal fix, silent and absolute. He simply lay there, staring at the ceiling, the dark pressing in, and a single, unshakable thought solidified in his mind. Enough. Enough of the quiet despair. Enough of the excuses. Enough of watching the world slip by just out of reach. Enough of telling himself he was a victim of circumstance, when in truth he was a victim of his own comfortable capitulation. He didn't know how he would fix it, not yet. The specifics were a foggy, intimidating blur. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him even as it ignited something new, that the old Lester, the one who worked just enough, the one who accepted his lot, was dead. He wasn't going to live like that anymore. He was going to find a way. He was going to make a way. And if making a way meant doing what others wouldn't, going further than others dared, then that's what he'd do. He'd outwork everyone. Not for glory, not for praise, but for Emily's future and for the quiet dignity he knew he deserved even if he hadn't earned it yet. The thought didn't feel like a burden, it felt like a liberation. A heavy, hard-won truth. The clock on the bedside table glowed 3:47 a.m. His alarm for the factory was set for 5:00 a.m. He didn't close his eyes again. When the shrill, obnoxious buzz finally tore through the pre-dawn quiet, Lester was already up. He'd been standing by the kitchen counter, sipping stale coffee, listening to the house breathe around him. The air was still thick with the lingering chill of night. His old routine, ingrained like the rust on an iron pipe, screamed at him to just go through the motions. Get dressed, eat breakfast. Drive to the plant, punch in, punch out, come home, repeat. That was the dance he knew. That was the groove he'd worn into his life. But today the groove felt like a rut, a deep, muddy rut. He made his lunch. 2 thick slices of bologna between white bread, a bruised apple, a thermos of lukewarm coffee, the same lunch he'd packed for 20 years. A small, familiar rebellion flared inside him. He grabbed an extra apple. Then, on an impulse that felt both reckless and necessary, he pulled out an old, faded notebook from a drawer, a spiral-bound thing he used to jot down occasional repair ideas, but mostly just grocery lists. He tossed it into his lunch pail. What for? He didn't know. Just something. A symbol, perhaps, of a mind that wouldn't simply shut off when the whistle blew. The drive to the factory was always the same. Dark roads, the quiet hum of his aging pickup, the occasional other lone headlights cutting through the gloom. The air was cold, crisp. He pulled into the employee lot, a sea of dented pickups and sensible sedans. Same faces walking through the gates, same weary shuffle. He punched his card, the metallic clack echoing the finality of another day begun. He was assigned to the press line, the same roaring, clanking beast he'd wrestled with for years. The rhythmic thud-hiss of the machine was a familiar lullaby of monotony. His hands moved automatically, feeding metal sheets into the maw, feeling the faint vibrations travel up his arms into his bones. The hours crawled. The dull ache in his shoulders started early, a constant companion. Around 11 a.m., the floor supervisor, a man named Henderson with a perpetually furrowed brow, walked by his station. Henderson rarely offered overtime unless he was desperate. Lester had always taken it when it fit, when the kids didn't have a game or Sarah needed help with something. Today, without even a flicker of hesitation, Lester met his eye. "Henderson," he called out, his voice a little rougher than usual over the din. Henderson paused, surprised. Lester wasn't usually the one to initiate conversation. "Yeah, Lester. Any extra hours today? I can stay." Henderson blinked, then squinted. "You, Lester. Thought you liked your evenings." Lester just nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. "Changed my mind. Need the work." Henderson shrugged, a small, grudging smile playing on his lips. "All right, Jenkins called in sick. You can take his spot on the late shift. Runs till 8. You sure?" "Sure," Lester said, his gaze unwavering. "Real sure." The commitment hung in the air, a silent vow, the first step. It was just an extra shift, an ordinary request, but to Lester it felt like throwing himself into a new current. The old Lester would have hesitated, weighed the fatigue against the slightly higher paycheck, and probably decided against it. The old Lester would have worried about being too tired for tomorrow. The new Lester just felt a quiet surge of resolve. 8 o'clock, 12 hours on the line. He felt it already in his knees, his back. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to back down, to say he'd made a mistake, to return to the familiar comfort of the 6 o'clock whistle. But he didn't. He picked up another metal sheet, the weight familiar, and fed it into the press. Thud hiss, just gotta do it. One more, and then another after that. He had made a promise to a girl whose dreams were on the line, and to a man he was finally ready to become. The 8 o'clock whistle that night wasn't a release, it was a blow. Lester felt like every cell in his body had been squeezed dry, then refilled with gravel. His shoulders burned, his lower back screamed, and the repetitive thud hiss of the press still echoed in his skull. Walking out to his beat-up sedan, the cool night air usually felt refreshing. Tonight, it just felt like another weight. He drove home in a fog, the streetlights blurring into streaks. Sarah met him at the door, a worried line between her brows. "You okay, Les? You look gray." He just grunted, too tired to form proper words, and headed straight for the shower, letting the hot water try to melt away the grit and ache. It didn't. Dinner was a silent affair, his fork moving like it weighed 10 pounds. By 9, he was in bed, the sheets feeling like rough sandpaper against his exhausted skin. Sleep came instantly, deep and dreamless, but it wasn't restorative. The alarm at 5 a.m. the next morning felt like a physical assault. His muscles were stiff, his joints protested with every movement. He lay there for a full minute, staring at the ceiling, the old cynicism creeping in. This is it. This is the trade. More pain for a few more dollars. He imagined rolling over, pulling the covers up, letting Henderson find someone else for the extra hours. The temptation was a warm, heavy blanket. Then he saw Emily's face in his mind, the way her eyes had dimmed when the college loan fell through. He remembered the fierce promise he'd made to himself in the quiet of his kitchen. With a groan, Lester swung his legs over the side of the bed. Every fiber of his being rebelled. Getting dressed was a slow, deliberate agony. He brewed the coffee extra strong, the bitter smell doing little to cut through the haze. Day 2. Just gotta get through day 2. By the end of that second 12-hour shift, he was moving like a rusty machine. He almost dropped a component, catching it just before it hit the floor, his heart hammering against his ribs. Henderson, walking by, gave him a questioning glance. "Long day, huh, Lester?" Lester just nodded, sweat stinging his eyes. Always. The next few days blurred into a grueling cycle. The factory hummed, the presses thudded, and Lester worked, always choosing the longer shifts. His hands, already calloused, started to crack around the knuckles. His usual quiet grew even more pronounced. He conserved every ounce of energy, even speech. Sarah noticed him falling asleep at the dinner table, his head slumping mid-chew. Mark and Emily, sensing his exhaustion, tried to be quieter. Their usual teenage banter softened to hushed tones. He managed to secure one small side job for Saturday, repairing old Mr. Fitzwilliam's leaky faucet and fixing a loose deck board. He told himself it would be easy. It was. After 6 hours at the factory, his back was already shot. Driving to Fitzwilliam's, he could feel the tremor in his hands. Every turn of the wrench, every swing of the hammer sent jolts of pain through his protesting muscles. He finished the job, took the crumpled $50 bill, and nearly collapsed on his own porch when he got home. He promised himself he'd start digging into those online courses, but he fell asleep on the couch with a textbook on basic coding open on his chest, drool seeping onto the page. The next week felt like a descent into some kind of quiet, personal hell. Day in, day out, the grind. The morning fatigue was now a constant companion. He started making small mistakes at the factory, misreading a spec sheet, dropping a tool. Nothing major enough to get him in trouble, but enough to shame him, enough to make him doubt if he was truly cut out for this. He caught his reflection in the greasy bathroom mirror at the factory one afternoon, eyes bloodshot, cheeks hollow, a weary ghost of himself. "What are you doing, Lester?" The voice in his head, the old, cynical voice, started to get louder. "You're just killing yourself for scraps. Nothing changes. You're just trading your life for a few more bills." He was behind on his online lessons. The car repair manual he'd bought still sat unread on the passenger seat. He felt like he was drowning, pulling himself through thick mud, only to find more mud ahead. One Tuesday morning, a particularly brutal shift had stretched into overtime. By the time he got home, it was almost 9. He found Emily at the kitchen table, poring over college brochures, a frustrated tear tracing a path down her cheek. She didn't look up when he came in. "Rough day?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. She just shook her head, a sniffle escaping. "It's just so much, Dad, and I don't know if we can do it. Maybe I should just go to community college, get a job." Her words were a knife twist, mirroring his own lifelong fear, his own silent acceptance of just enough. He saw the resignation in her young eyes, the very thing he was fighting against. It fueled a new, desperate wave of energy. He wanted to tell her they would make it work, but the words felt hollow in his own mouth. He felt the crushing weight of his initial promise and the crushing weight of his current exhaustion. He was failing. He was failing her. He almost reached for a pack of cigarettes, a habit he'd kicked years ago just to have something to do with his trembling hands. That night, alone in his bed, listening to Sarah's even breathing beside him, Lester felt like quitting. He imagined calling Henderson tomorrow, telling him he couldn't do the extra shifts anymore. He imagined putting the online course material in the trash. He imagined telling Emily she was right, that community college was probably best. The thought was sweet, tempting, a warm embrace after weeks of cold struggle. But then another image broke through the fog of exhaustion. Emily's face, not tearful but radiant, walking across a graduation stage, a diploma in her hand. And next to her a small, proud man, not just getting by, but standing tall, knowing he had made it happen. He closed his eyes, knuckles white as he clenched his hands into fists. He wasn't doing this for himself. He was doing it for her, and for the man he was supposed to be. He might be slow, he might be tired, he might even fail a few times, but he would not stop. He couldn't. It wasn't about being good at it right away. It was about showing up every single damn day, even when every bone in his body begged him to stay home. It was about being too stubborn to quit, because if he quit, then the old Lester would win, and the old Lester had never been enough. The 8 o'clock whistle that night wasn't a release, it was a blow. Lester felt like every cell in his body had been squeezed dry, then refilled with gravel. His shoulders burned, his lower back screamed, and the repetitive thud hiss of the press still echoed in his skull. Walking out to his beat-up sedan, the cool night air usually felt refreshing. Tonight it just felt like another weight. He drove home in a fog, the streetlights blurring into streaks. Sarah met him at the door, a worried line between her brows. "You okay, Les? You look gray." He just grunted, too tired to form proper words, and headed straight for the shower, letting the hot water try to melt away the grit and ache. It didn't. Dinner was a silent affair, his fork moving like it weighed 10 pounds. By 9, he was in bed, the sheets feeling like rough sandpaper against his exhausted skin. Sleep came instantly, deep and dreamless, but it wasn't restorative. The alarm at 5 a.m. the next morning felt like a physical assault. His muscles were stiff, his joints protested with every movement. He lay there for a full minute, staring at the ceiling, the old cynicism creeping in. This is it. This is the trade. More pain for a few more dollars. He imagined rolling over, pulling the covers up, letting Henderson find someone else for the extra hours. The temptation was a warm, heavy blanket. Then he saw Emily's face in his mind, the way her eyes had dimmed when the college loan fell through. He remembered the fierce promise he'd made to himself in the quiet of his kitchen. With a groan, Lester swung his legs over the side of the bed. Every fiber of his being rebelled. Getting dressed was a slow, deliberate agony. He brewed the coffee extra strong, the bitter smell doing little to cut through the haze. Day 2. Just gotta get through day 2. By the end of that second 12-hour shift, he was moving like a rusty machine. He almost dropped a component, catching it just before it hit the floor, his heart hammering against his ribs. Henderson, walking by, gave him a questioning glance. "Long day, huh, Lester?" Lester just nodded, sweat stinging his eyes. Always. The next few days blurred into a grueling cycle. The factory hummed, the presses thudded, and Lester worked, always choosing the longer shifts. His hands, already calloused, started to crack around the knuckles. His usual quiet grew even more pronounced. He conserved every ounce of energy, even speech. Sarah noticed him falling asleep at the dinner table, his head slumping mid-chew. Mark and Emily, sensing his exhaustion, tried to be quieter. Their usual teenage banter softened to hushed tones. He managed to secure one small side job for Saturday, repairing old Mr. Fitzwilliam's leaky faucet and fixing a loose deck board. He told himself it would be easy. It was. After 6 hours at the factory, his back was already shot. Driving to Fitzwilliam's, he could feel the tremor in his hands. Every turn of the wrench, every swing of the hammer sent jolts of pain through his protesting muscles. He finished the job, took the crumpled $50 bill, and nearly collapsed on his own porch when he got home. He promised himself he'd start digging into those online courses, but he fell asleep on the couch with a textbook on basic coding open on his chest, drool seeping onto the page. The next week felt like a descent into some kind of quiet, personal hell. Day in, day out, the grind. The morning fatigue was now a constant companion. He started making small mistakes at the factory, misreading a spec sheet, dropping a tool. Nothing major enough to get him in trouble, but enough to shame him, enough to make him doubt if he was truly cut out for this. He caught his reflection in the greasy bathroom mirror at the factory one afternoon, eyes bloodshot, cheeks hollow, a weary ghost of himself. "What are you doing, Lester?" The voice in his head, the old, cynical voice, started to get louder. "You're just killing yourself for scraps. Nothing changes. You're just trading your life for a few more bills." He was behind on his online lessons. The car repair manual he'd bought still sat unread on the passenger seat. He felt like he was drowning, pulling himself through thick mud, only to find more mud ahead. One Tuesday morning, a particularly brutal shift had stretched into overtime. By the time he got home, it was almost 9. He found Emily at the kitchen table, poring over college brochures, a frustrated tear tracing a path down her cheek. She didn't look up when he came in. "Rough day?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. She just shook her head, a sniffle escaping. "It's just so much, Dad, and I don't know if we can do it. Maybe I should just go to community college, get a job." Her words were a knife twist, mirroring his own lifelong fear, his own silent acceptance of just enough. He saw the resignation in her young eyes, the very thing he was fighting against. It fueled a new, desperate wave of energy. He wanted to tell her they would make it work, but the words felt hollow in his own mouth. He felt the crushing weight of his initial promise and the crushing weight of his current exhaustion. He was failing. He was failing her. He almost reached for a pack of cigarettes, a habit he'd kicked years ago just to have something to do with his trembling hands. That night, alone in his bed, listening to Sarah's even breathing beside him, Lester felt like quitting. He imagined calling Henderson tomorrow, telling him he couldn't do the extra shifts anymore. He imagined putting the online course material in the trash. He imagined telling Emily she was right, that community college was probably best. The thought was sweet, tempting, a warm embrace after weeks of cold struggle. But then another image broke through the fog of exhaustion. Emily's face, not tearful but radiant, walking across a graduation stage, a diploma in her hand. And next to her, a small, proud man, not just getting by, but standing tall, knowing he had made it happen. He closed his eyes, knuckles white, as he clenched his hands into fists. He wasn't doing this for himself. He was doing it for her, and for the man he was supposed to be. He might be slow, he might be tired. He might even fail a few times, but he would not stop. He couldn't. It wasn't about being good at it right away. It was about showing up every single damn day, even when every bone in his body begged him to stay home. It was about being too stubborn to quit. Because if he quit, then the old Lester would win. And the old Lester had never been enough. But the new Lester, the one forged in the crucible of Emily's silent plea, he was capable of more. He had to be. The next morning, the factory floor still hummed with the familiar drone, but Lester moved with a slightly different cadence. The exhaustion was still a thick blanket, but beneath it, a quiet hum had begun. He wasn't just enduring, he was observing. He watched the more experienced mechanics, not just to complete his task, but to understand the why behind their methods. During breaks, instead of staring blankly at the wall, his phone was out, a greasy thumb swiping through schematics for car engines, diagrams for roof trusses. The online course materials, once a foreign language, began to make a tiny bit of sense. He absorbed. He repeated. He applied. By the end of the 3rd week, something subtle had shifted. Henderson, a man whose observations rarely extended beyond production quotas, caught Lester still on the line an hour after most of the night shift had clocked out. Lester was troubleshooting a tricky hydraulic press, an issue that usually required a specialist. Henderson just grunted, then tossed him an extra pair of gloves. "You sticking around for morning crew too, Miller?" he'd asked, not unkindly. Lester just wiped grease from his forehead. "Just trying to get this bird to sing, Henderson." The supervisor nodded, a flicker of something Lester couldn't quite place in his eyes, maybe respect, maybe just surprise. His coworkers noticed too. "Still at it, Lester?" they'd ask, heading for the parking lot. A few shook their heads, a mix of pity and bewilderment. Others, the older guys, just gave him a knowing nod, recognizing a fire they once carried or perhaps had long since let die. He wasn't looking for their approval or even their understanding. He was looking for results. And slowly, agonizingly slowly, the results started to trickle in. He fixed old Mrs. Albright's leaky faucet on a Saturday morning, earning a crisp $50 bill and a pie. He spent a Sunday afternoon patching Mr. Rodriguez's broken fence, exchanging labor for fresh vegetables and a 20. Each small victory, each earned dollar was a brick laid on the foundation of his conviction. Weeks bled into months. The factory floor was no longer just a place of toil. It was a classroom, a proving ground. Lester learned to anticipate machine failures, to fix minor issues before they escalated, earning him a grudging appreciation from the line managers. He became the guy Henderson would call when a sudden order came in, knowing Lester would be there, no complaints, just steady hands and an unyielding will. He wasn't just working hard. He was working smart, applying the late-night online lessons to his real-world tasks, improving his efficiency, his value. His hands, once merely strong, now possessed a craftsman's precision, honed by countless hours of fiddling with engines, tightening joints, and measuring lumber. The lines on his face were deeper, etched by perpetual fatigue, but they weren't lines of defeat anymore. They were etchings of purpose. He still looked like the same Lester, the quiet factory man, but when you caught his eye, there was a new glint there, a calm, unwavering flame. At home, the transformation was even more profound, if less outwardly dramatic. The ancient Ford in their driveway, a constant source of anxiety, now purred like a kitten after Lester spent 2 consecutive weekends under its hood, applying knowledge he'd gleaned from a YouTube series he watched after Mark and Emily were asleep. The persistent drip in the bathroom, a sound that had been background noise for years, was gone. He'd even started patching the garage roof, working in snatched hours before dawn or after dinner, the sound of his hammer a rhythmic counterpoint to the crickets. Sarah, who had initially watched his frenetic new pace with a worried frown, now saw the small but steady pile of receipts for materials, the growing balance in the separate savings account he'd opened, specifically for Emily. She saw the relief that washed over Emily's face when he showed her the updated tuition fund, still modest but growing. It was a living testament to his promise. He was still tired, always tired, but he carried himself differently. He walked with a slight lean, not from weariness, but from a quiet internal momentum that propelled him forward. The shadow of resignation that had clung to him for years had finally begun to lift, replaced by a fierce, undeniable light, the light of a man who was actively, stubbornly creating his own luck. The first whispers of change at the factory weren't about Lester's overtime sheets. Those had been thick for weeks. It was something in his eyes. The weariness was still there, a constant companion, but it no longer held the flat, resigned look it once did. Now there was a sharpness, an almost predatory focus when he tackled a task. He wasn't just doing his job. He was mastering every nuance, finding efficiencies, anticipating breakdowns before they happened. Supervisors, initially just happy for the extra pair of hands, started to notice the dip in rejected parts on his line, the smooth hum of machinery he'd recently serviced. "Lester," old Frank, the floor manager, grunted one Tuesday, pausing by his station. "You're clocking more hours than the night shift these days. Everything all right at home?" Lester just gave a tight, almost imperceptible nod, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Everything's getting there, Frank." Frank studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Keep it up. We appreciate the dedication." He walked away, shaking his head slightly, but there was an undertone of respect in his glance. Others, too, began to observe. The guys on break might tease him about living at the plant, but there was no real malice, only a dawning realization that Lester was playing a different game now. He wasn't just showing up, he was showing out. At home, the garage roof, once a patchwork of tarps and fading shingles, now boasted a fresh, uniform layer. The bathroom drip was a forgotten memory, and the persistent hum from the ancient refrigerator was finally silenced by a new, more efficient model that Lester had researched, purchased used, and installed himself. Sarah saw the bills, yes, but she also saw the calm confidence in his stride, the lighter way he hummed a forgotten tune while cooking Sunday breakfast, a rare occurrence before. Emily, preparing for her final year of high school, would often find him at the kitchen table late at night, a worn textbook open beside a laptop glowing with online tutorials. Sometimes, she'd ask him about what he was learning, and he'd patiently explain the intricacies of basic plumbing or small engine repair, his voice infused with a quiet enthusiasm she hadn't heard in years. He wasn't just earning money. He was expanding his world, one skill, one solved problem, one extra hour at a time. The fear in Emily's eyes had faded, replaced by a nascent hope, fueled by the tangible progress of her college fund and the unwavering resolve of her father. She started talking about internships, about her future, with a brightness that had almost been extinguished. Lester no longer saw a financial wall. He saw a path, arduous but clear, and he was building it brick by laborious brick. One Saturday, after he'd spent the morning fixing old Mr. Henderson's leaky faucet for a little extra cash, Mark, his son, was watching him clean his tools. "Dad," Mark ventured, kicking at a loose pebble, "why do you work so much?" Mr. Henderson could have called a plumber. Lester wiped grease from a wrench with a rag. He could have, son. But then Mr. Henderson would be out $100, and your mom and I would be $100 short for your sister's tuition, or for that new roof. He paused, looking at his son, his gaze soft but firm. Look, Mark, people talk about luck. Good luck, bad luck. But you know what luck really is? He leaned in, his voice low, as if sharing a secret. It's what happens when opportunity meets preparation. And sometimes you gotta make your own damn opportunities. And you gotta prepare more than anyone else in the room. He stood up, looking out at their small, older house, now looking a little less tired itself. It ain't pretty, son. It ain't easy. You'll be tired, you'll feel like quitting. But if you want something different, something more than what everyone else is getting, you gotta do something different. You gotta put in more. Way more. More hours, more learning, more effort, more thought. Nobody's gonna hand you a damn thing. You gotta earn it every single day, and then some. He tapped Mark lightly on the shoulder. That's how you break through. That's how you build a life you're proud of for yourself and for the people you love. And that, you see, is the quiet, undeniable truth of it. There are men just like Lester in every factory, every office, every town square who once believed their fate was sealed. But then a moment comes, a crack in the routine, a glimpse of a different future, and they make a choice. They decide to outwork everyone. They decide to build their own damn bridge.